Hello, my name is Lena Connor, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's event entitled Fossil Funding, Should We Divest from Fossil Fuels? This event is co-sponsored by 4 organizations: the Pomona Student Union, the Associated Students of Pomona College, and the Claremont College's Sustainability Coalition, and last but certainly not least, Sustainable Claremont. The Associated Students of Pomona College exists to provide for reasonable and effective student participation in the governance of the college, to be a representative voice of the students both on and off campus, and to provide programs and services to assist in the completion of the educational mission of the college. The Claremont College's Sustainability Coalition is a 5-college organization that seeks to unite the colleges in a sustainable vision for our consortium, and to act as a liaison between the colleges and statewide and nationwide environmental campaigns. Sustainable Claremont engages people in education and action to create a more sustainable community, environmentally, socially, and economically, in the city of Claremont and beyond. And finally, the Pomona Student Union is a nonpartisan, student-run organization that works to increase campus dialogue on significant issues. We do so by bringing speakers together in order to represent multiple angles on various current events and debates. We do not intend to promote any single perspective, but instead to encourage the campus community to challenge assumptions and consider all points of view. All of the organizations represented here hope that the conversation about divestment does not stop after tonight, but instead that you consider what was said in this event and continue to dialogue with friends, peers, and professors. Tonight we're discussing the proposition of removing investments in fossil fuel companies in light of their contribution to climate change and environmental degradation. Bill McKibben, the famed environmental activist who founded the international climate movement 350.org, unveiled the fossil fuels divestment campaign this winter in his nationwide Do the Math tour, in which he calculated that, in his opinion, financially supporting any fossil fuel endeavor, given the scale of the resulting climate effect, is foolhardy. 350.org and a coalition of environmental organizations are facilitating this divestment movement, calling for institutions, specifically colleges like ours, and individuals to pull their investments from the world's 200 large coal, oil, and gas companies. Here to discuss the pros and cons of divestment in our community is tonight's talented panel. They're not in the order that I intended them to be, but I forgot to tell them to be. So first we have Jess Grady Benson, a Pitzer student, a 350 intern, and a co-leader of the Claremont College's divestment team, which has been featured in the New York Times, the Huffington Post, the Nation, and the Rolling Stone magazine. And I bet you can tell which one she is. Then we have next to her John Jurowitz, lecturer in economics at Pomona, who teaches natural resource economics and energy economics and has much experience in the professional energy sector. Char Miller is our moderator at the end, who's W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis at Pomona, the director of the EA program, and who teaches environmental history and will be our moderator for the evening. Heather Williams, chair of the Pomona Politics Department, teaches several environmental politics classes, including global politics of food, agriculture, and water. William Asher, Donald C. McKenna Professor of Government and Economics at Claremont McKenna, teaches environmental policy and sustainable economic development. And finally, Paul Steinberg, Associate Professor of Political Science and Environmental Policy at Harvard-Mudd, teaches comparative environmental policy and the role of social movements in environmental decision-making. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers. Before we begin, I must ask everyone to silence their cell phones. The format of the event will be a panel discussion with 4 segments. Panelists will open with 4-minute intros, and then we'll move on to a 20-minute segment of moderated questions from Char, then a 20-minute segment of back-and-forth conversation and debate, and then finally a 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how many questions you have, Q&A, moderated Q&A with the audience. So let the event begin.
First of all, I'm so excited to see so many people here, both familiar and unfamiliar faces, and I hope we'll get to have a really great educational and stimulating conversation tonight about divestment. We are all here tonight because we need to mitigate the climate crisis for the sake of human rights and a livable planet. Groups and organizations have been working for decades on multiple strategies to avoid climate catastrophe, yet only political victory we've seen is the 2009 Copenhagen Accord Global Agreement to limit global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. The Carbon Tracker Initiative reports that the fossil fuel industry has access to 5 times the amount of coal, oil, and natural gas that would push us past this 2-degree target. This means that the fossil fuel industry must keep 80% of their reserves underground. We found that we can't gain enough social or political change within the current paradigm that allows the fossil fuel industry to shape not only our laws, but every aspect of the way that we live. Through the acquisition and holding of fossil fuel investments, the Claremont colleges are implicitly supporting this industry. As institutions known for taking action to confront issues of social responsibility and sustainability, it is inconsistent and hypocritical for the Claremont colleges to remain invested in fossil fuels. For example, Pitzer College holds environmental sustainability as one of its core values as expressed by its mission statement. It has been said that sustainability is part of our DNA. Divestment is not simply a symbolic action, but an opportunity to actualize these core values and stand out as leaders in environmental and social responsibility. Our request for divestment includes the immediate freeze of new investments in the fossil fuel industry and the complete phase out or divestment of all existing fossil fuel investments within 5 years. To clarify, we are focusing on the 200 top oil, gas, and coal companies with the largest fossil fuel reserves. The Claremont College's divestment team is comprised of over 60 active members from all 5 colleges, with support from a number of faculty and alumni. Our petition currently has over 850 signatures of support from the 5Cs alone. Just yesterday, we passed a resolution through the Pitzer Student Senate in favor of divestment with only 1 vote against us. Our campaign alone has drawn extensive media coverage by The Nation, The New York Times, Rolling Stone, and KPCC Radio. The campaign for fossil fuel divestment extends well beyond the boundaries of our campuses, encompassing over 252 other colleges and universities. Cities such as Seattle and San Francisco, as well as some religious institutions, are considering divestment. This movement has the potential to initiate change on a large scale. This campaign is about divestment, but it's about more than that. It's about building a movement to solve the climate crisis. We live in a society in which true carbon neutrality is virtually impossible because of the political and economic stronghold of the fossil fuel industry. The environmental and social costs incurred by this industry are being externalized. These companies have enough lobbying power to protect their subsidies and avoid strict regulation. We must strip the fossil fuel industry of their social license to profit from an unsustainable future. This will pave the way for political and social paradigm shifts that will allow us to make changes we need to mitigate the climate crisis. Divestment is by no means an ultimate solution. It is the essential first step.
Okay, well, I don't make a habit of stepping in front of fast-moving trains, but I think we need to slow down just a little bit and proceed deliberately and make the most of this opportunity and make sure that it doesn't politically backfire on us. Bill McKibben himself has said that this is a political strategy born of frustration, and I sympathize. Personally, I'm not too enthusiastic, however, about joining in a largely symbolic, quixotic campaign born of frustration that may, in fact, and I think it will be rather ineffective and perhaps even counterproductive. At a minimum, I think this effort needs to be politically repackaged by the 5Cs and supplemented with far more substantive and effective initiatives. So I stand here tonight as your unsolicited, self-appointed political advisor. Make no mistake, this is not going to have any real direct impact on these companies. We can't hurt these companies as investors. They don't need you as investors. I'll elaborate later during discussion. They need you as consumers. They need you as consumers and placated, non-active voters. You need to be active voters and active consumers. This campaign is largely political and symbolic, but we don't want to make it easy for our political enemies to pull some jiu-jitsu move and use the symbol to their own advantage, which I think they all too easily can do. It's all too easy for our enemies basically to caricature you as a bunch of rich elitist students marching around protesting, because that's what students do, right? I've already heard that from Sean Hannity and others, all right? Everyone knows you drive cars, everyone knows you fly in airplanes, and you have no political credibility without real sacrifice, visible sacrifice. And this initiative, considered only in its isolation as divestment, involves no great sacrifice. Instead, it can all too easily be cast as hypocritical, elite, limousine liberalism, self-righteousness. Now, you're never going to get Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity on your side. I understand that, but don't serve them up softballs. This has to be just one feature of a much more aggressive plan. This isn't the cornerstone of anything. This is the flag on the flagpole at the top of the building. This is flying your colors. It's not the beef. So where's the beef? Well, your political consultant is here to give you the beef. So I have a 5-point plan. I'm going to call this the Claremont 5C plan. It's based on 2 underlying objectives. First, reduce carbon emissions. Second, jumpstart Plan B. What's Plan B? It's renewables. If you're not doing one of those 2 things, you ain't doing anything. First, very aggressively pursue all energy efficiency and renewable technologies on campus. And I know the campuses are all moving in that direction, but you've got to do it aggressively. And at the end of the day, you're still going to be consuming electricity from Edison. I want you to go out and buy renewable energy credits and convert all that electricity into renewable electricity so we can say we're 100% renewable with our purchases from Edison. Now, second, we need to become net zero carbon campuses. And this must include automobile use and airline flights as well. You've got absolutely no political credibility without covering those things. Now, fortunately, you've got an avenue now to do it in California. On January 1st, the California Air Resources Board kicked off a cap and trade program. It involves an annual issuance of permission slips. You can go out and buy those permission slips. We can have a big party on Walker Beach. We can tear them up on Earth Day, and they'll no longer be in other people's hands. I've got 3 more things, and I'll raise them in discussion.
Heather, be as excited.
First of all, let me say that it's a huge honor to be here, and I'm really energized, and I'm just really energized by your commitment to doing something about climate change. As I understand the position on divestment of the movement, and I'm taking this off the website of one of the participating colleges, saying it is contradictory and self-defeating that the college invests its endowment in companies that threaten the future of its students, community, and life on Earth as we know it. The moral case for divesting from fossil fuel companies, as I see it, is that these are mammoth companies who have extracted their profits at the expense of human communities around the world, showing reckless disregard for human life, health, species, and the environment. Unfortunately, Shell, BP, Exxon, and Chevron are bywords for some of the most devastating environmental spills and contamination on Earth. On climate change, their actions have been reprehensible. While they've continued to pursue extractions in increasingly risky areas, they've been funding AstroTurf, i.e. fake grassroots organizations that appear to create the sense that there's a groundswell for business as usual when there isn't. They back climate change skeptics and utilize media apparatuses to skew press coverage of the issue to make it appear that there is controversy on the numbers and the models when there really isn't. They are enjoying ample public subsidies for extraction, refining, distribution, and trade while flouting regulatory standards and often paying little or nothing in corporate income tax. So I'm not a fan. Divestment also there's a strong moral case for it. It's a form of financial boycott, and it's as a nonviolent tactic, it has an esteemed history in struggles for justice. Many of you know about the Great Boycott of United Farm Workers, the lettuce boycott. Maybe you're old enough to have remembered the Taco Bell boycott of the Immokalee workers in Florida, the South African divestment campaign. Before I was born, the Montgomery bus boycott. In the last century, the boycotts of Congolese rubber in the 19th century to fight the slave trade. In fact, the word boycott comes from the Lord Boycott, who was a nasty English landowner whose businesses were shunned on behalf of the Irish who were displaced by him. There were boycotts of Jacobins and Parisian laborers of coffee from Saint-Domingue in support of ending slavery in Haiti. So that being said, I'd love to follow that by saying, go for it, fight. Divestment is the single most important thing you can do in the face of climate change. Unfortunately, that's not quite my message. Morally, I think you're right. Tactically speaking, consider that this campaign singularly pursued may be folly, and I think I agree with you, John, on many of the things you say. But as a political scientist, I'm going to focus more on politics. And here's why I think what I do. A lot of people say, I don't think this will make much of a difference, but I want to make a statement. I say don't spend inordinate time and resources on statements when you actually could make a difference. My advice, I have 2 points. If you pursue divestment, and I think that people have decided this is a good thing to do. The first thing, 2 words. A very wise labor organizer once said to me many years ago, 2 words, fight last. People often make the mistake of wanting to show their commitment by taking the most personal risks possible, occupying buildings, doing hunger strikes, etc. But understand that the media will frame that more as an action than a conversation. And so don't marginalize yourself before you have to. And second of all, consider using your time and energy to direct pressure on the one entity that has the power to make an enormous long-term impact in the output of greenhouse gases, the US federal government. If no levy is put on the output portion of greenhouse gases, effectively sending a price signal on all goods and services, either in the form of a good cap and trade bill or a carbon tax, nothing else really matters. So I think you have power, and small groups often have inordinate power to influence the government through the boring actions of petitions and speeches and policing votes in Congress. So think about doing that as a supplement to what you're doing. Thank you.
Would the people in the back like to move to the front, get some seats? Because this is going to go on for 4 or 5 hours. There's plenty of seats here. This should not count against my time, okay? I think I'll also take a consequentialist position here and acknowledge that there are symbolic reasons, there are Kantian reasons to take a position, but I'm going to focus 2 observations on the consequences of divestment, and then I'm going to make some suggestions. Not all that different from what you just heard, in fact. The first observation is that the long-term impact on hydrocarbon companies would be very close to 0. Their stock value is determined basically by price-earnings ratios and other things of that sort, and whether they hit good veins. It's not going to make a difference if the colleges or even a whole bunch of different institutions divest. That's not really what the game is. Second, some of the students asked, would this be a hit on Pomona's endowment if Pomona and other universities and colleges divest? And the answer is only slightly, but not for the reason you might think. It's not because oil stocks are actually more profitable. If you take into account the volatility and risk, most things are about the same in terms of risk-averse earnings. It's because if you have to sell something at a particular time dictated by factors other than your own timing, you're going to lose a little bit. But that's not really an important factor. Now, in terms of recommendations, I think that targeting all hydrocarbon producers is way too broad. This is an opportunity to focus on the most environmentally problematic ones and the most problematic types of hydrocarbon exploitation, like tar sands, both in Canada and in Venezuela. Those are things that cause a lot more pollution, and it seems to me that you want to have a more pinpointed focus. You can, of course, push divestment for promotional purposes rather than directly economic impacts. But again, you'd have more impact if you focus more narrowly on the firms that are doing the most damage. I also think it's odd to focus on supply rather than demand. Professor Jurowitz mentioned this. There are lots of things that could be done on the demand side. For example, some cities have gone through municipalization of their electric utilities because they find that their private utilities are not using as much renewable resources as they could. So they take over the electric company with a mandate to do more in terms of renewables. You can also eliminate subsidies. This has been the bane of a lot of the environmental problems, and it's bad economics. There's a real win-win if you eliminate subsidies. Then the economy becomes more efficient, and in addition to that, the environment gets to be better. Finally, I'd like to raise the question, what are your comparative advantages? And remember, in economics, a comparative advantage is not how well you do compared to other people. A comparative advantage is what you do compared to other things you can do. You're very energetic. There are various efforts you can undertake. The question you have to ask is, are you getting the greatest bang for your time by focusing on divestment?
Thank you again to the organizers for putting this together. It seems to me that the fundamental question before us is whether young people can change their world for the better. Certainly, if I were in the position of the students who are leading this campaign, notwithstanding the minutiae of discussions of tactics, which I look forward to engaging in tonight, that would be the big question weighing over my mind. Can I actually make a difference? And so before digging into the details, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about sort of how social change happens in different national contexts, I'd like to address that big question, that deeper question first. On that question, let there be no doubt that students can change the course of history. The historical record is very clear on this. Let's not forget that the first Earth Day, 1970, the thing that got the ball rolling with respect to legislation and changing the regulatory framework within which businesses operate in the United States and abroad, those were students. That was a campus movement. We give the credit to the Senator Gaylord Nelson who kicked the thing off, but those were students, okay? And so the millions of people who turned out are proof that young people can make a difference. And the political momentum generated from that, as I say, is what made it possible for policymakers to move on these things. As a matter of fact, in a comparative assessment of how different countries responded to student protests in the 1970s, it's noted in a book called Green States and Social Movements by Dryzek and colleagues, that for the Nixon administration, the environment appeared to be one problem that maybe they could do something about. That is to say, they were faced on all sides with demands with respect to civil rights, Vietnam, and so forth, and maybe the environment was something they could do something about. So students matter. This carpet under your feet has no formaldehyde. The reason is students, and the student contribution to the creation of the political momentum that allowed the banning of cancer-causing formaldehyde from carpets. The reason why these bulbs are not incandescent, the reason why there's no lead paint on the walls, this is because of students. The reason why we can see Mount Baldy today, it's in part, as I say, because of students. There would not be environmental studies professors up here were it not for student demand for environmental courses. That's how the cash flows within a university system. Your demand, every time you select a course, you are in effect voting. You are saying something about what you believe to be valuable and important, and that's where the resources flow, and that's how hires are made. So, on this question, let's be absolutely clear that you can make a difference. Most recently, with respect to LEED certified buildings, college campuses have been way out in front on LEED certified buildings, and that movement nationwide has transformed the world's largest industry, the building construction industry, which is larger than the oil industry. Between 2008 and 2010, the market for green buildings grew by 50% to over $55 billion. Cities and states and federal governments have followed suit, often requiring LEED certification. All new U.S. embassies everywhere in the world must now meet LEED certified standards. And again, that was in large part because of a push on college campuses as well as in other areas of the nonprofit sector. Now, college students, I've been teaching for a long time, and college students have a habit of asking, I've actually taught 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, not 11th, 12th undergraduate, master's, and PhD level since the 1980s. And let me say, I've learned over the course of these events that students have a habit of asking really annoying questions. What makes these questions so annoying is that they're simple questions. You'll also notice that the greatest intellectuals of our time, people like Jared Diamond, have a habit of asking simple questions. So why is there so much war in the world? Why is there so much poverty? Why do companies pollute? Why aren't more people speaking out on this issue? We older people like to say, you know, it's a lot more complicated. And it is a lot more complicated than that. And yet, there is something in the simple question that makes the simple question the most profound question of all. One such question was posed in Nashville, 1960, during the lunch counter sit-ins, which were led by college students. It wasn't just Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, it was college students at those lunch counters. And in Memphis, the students one day marched across town to City Hall, and in a very rare moment, the mayor, this was Nashville, not Memphis, this was in Nashville, similar dynamics occurring in Memphis at the time. The mayor of Nashville, a man by the name of Ben West, was asked a very annoying question by a student. A young student named Diane Nash asked the mayor, and it turns out the media was there with microphones that picked all of this up. She said, "Mr. Mayor, do you personally believe that restaurants should deny service to African Americans?" Completely putting this man on the spot with this annoying question. And in that moment of reckoning, faced with this very intense question, he said, "I believe everybody should be served at these restaurants." And it went nationwide in the media. The lunch counters were desegregated within 3 weeks. And the Civil Rights Act was passed 4 years later. Okay, so in conclusion, students are now asking more annoyingly simple questions like, how does the college invest its money, and why are we supporting things that are not supporting our future? And so I look forward to getting into the minutia of the debate, but I just want to be sure that we don't lose sight of these big and simple questions that have brought us here. Thank you.
So in line with the simple questions that Paul has proposed we speak to, let me ask Jess, first of all, a response to the critiques in part, especially around tactics, and whether there is a response to John and Heather and Bill's concerns.
First of all, I think as environmental analysis majors, as I feel many of us in the audience are, we're constantly thinking about what's the best way to use my energy to make a difference. I'm prepared to spend the rest of my life trying to make a difference, and this opportunity came at a really, really critical time, I believe. As all of us have discussed, I think students have an incredible amount of unique power to create change politically and to drive political momentum towards larger change, even if it starts with very simple actions. This divestment movement is not only symbolic, as I mentioned before. We're working towards paradigm shift. We don't claim that divestment is the end-all be-all solution to the climate crisis. That would be ridiculous. But we do believe that it's a great opportunity to provide students with a chance to start a public discourse about the nature of the fossil fuel industry and the nature of our fossil fuel run political economy, basically. And the economic effect on the fossil fuel industry, we also do not claim through divestment to be gigantic. We don't think that withdrawing the $3 billion endowment of the collective 5 colleges is going to hurt the bottom line of the fossil fuel industry. That's completely ignorant. But we do believe that there is going to be a huge domino effect from that movement and from the united network that we've created with over 250 schools across the nation. This movement has been going on for 4 months, and there are schools adding to the list of divestment campaigns every single day. This movement has an incredible amount of momentum, and it can only lead towards bigger change. In terms of focusing on renewable energy projects on campus, divestment and renewable energy projects are not mutually exclusive. We don't have to stop one to do the other. They're happening all the time. Last year I participated in an internship to create a climate action plan for Pitzer College, and we did a greenhouse gas emissions reduction report and created all sorts of plans for how to proceed towards carbon neutrality. Guess what our date for projected carbon neutrality was? 2050. We don't have that kind of time to wait. Even if we push forward aggressively. We can't wait till 2050 to divest from fossil fuels. If we don't divest now, any actions we take in the meanwhile will be illegitimate. They'll be inconsistent with our mission. How can we fund the progress and momentum of our schools with an industry that is completely contradicting those values?
So John, my simple question for you is, you had 3 more points.
You're right, you're
Less
right.
than 2 minutes to do it.
Sorry, you're so kind to ask. Okay, so point number 3. Get all of the campuses within California to do the same thing relative to going out and buying these carbon permission slips from the California Air Resources Board and retiring them in order to zero net out all the carbon on campus. Number 4, and I don't know about a lot of hope for this, but this is part of an overall political plan, and that is, at the federal level, we need to try to convince, or we need to certainly put out an initiative to rebalance the federal tax structure. What's that about? We tax good stuff. We tax labor. We tax investment. Screw that. Tax the bad stuff. Rebalance things, dollar for dollar. It's a free lunch. You don't get many free lunches. This is a free lunch. And finally, let me pick up on something that Bill said, and that is the conditionality of divestiture. I don't buy into just saying, here's a list of 200 bad guys in the world. They're existentially bad. People need to be flagged and pilloried for their behavior. I can't say that all 200 people on that list are bad just because they're supplying fossil fuels. We're all using fossil fuels. And this is a matter of political positioning, too. You need to get them to refuse to do something. You need to get them to refuse to endorse meaningful cap and trade or taxes on carbon. And when they refuse to do that, then they're out of here. That's when you throw them away. And that's very, very important in terms of political positioning. So, that's my 5-point plan, and I dare you to adopt it, and if you do, you're calling my bluff and I'll have to join you.
So Heather, does what John has said, at least the last 3, reach towards some of the questions that you raised about tactics?
I think it does, although I feel that, John, what you're identifying is a really important form of prefigurative politics, of bringing our actions in line with our stated values. I think that's incredibly important. But ultimately, the idea of people engaging in moral action that maybe isn't in their own interest is maybe it's necessary but not sufficient. I think we actually have to have a conversation about what set of federal policies we support. The U.S. Per capita is one of the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitters, and if you think about historical accumulation of emissions, we may be the highest except for some of the northern countries like Iceland or something. But so I actually think that we have to have this really hard conversation about parsing which pieces of federal legislation are viable. We also have a second term of the Obama administration, and it's do or die right now. The EPA has gone to court. They have received a ruling that enables them to regulate CO2 as a pollutant. That's an incredibly important ruling, but it takes a lot of guts to actually act on that in the face of congressional inaction on this. I also think we have a new Democratic representative for this district, Judy Chu, who I think has her heart in the right place, but isn't receiving nearly enough support from people in the district. She has written and said she has joined the House Sustainable Energy Environmental Coalition in Congress, which is fighting the political attacks aimed at the EPA and working to safeguard the public protections found in the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. I think it's really important to thank her for that action and to use, for Democrats in the House, to use the bully pulpit of being a minority party to call out the vote buying and the political favoritism and the corporate welfare that's being extended to some of the worst polluters out there. So I think there's a role for that in addition to also walking the walk.
So let me real quickly ask a second question, Heather. If Congress has been so inactive, and it has been, if it's dominated in the House by the Republican Party, and if the Obama administration has, through its first term, not acted on these issues, what actually is going to get them to act? I mean, the Democrats as a minority party have no power whatsoever. They can't even go to meetings.
Everything, and I was actually talking with someone last night who was in the administration. They said everything was aimed at re-election. And so now, none of these people have a job in 4 years. And so there's a really different set of incentives, and they're thinking about what is their historical legacy. So take advantage of the fact that all these people want to go down in history as having done the right thing where possible. And so I think they may have a certain kind of second-term courage here that's certainly worth testing. No harm done in making the Obama administration understand how important this is to you.
Bill, you talked about comparative advantages and argued that the greatest bang for the buck needs to be what?
I think it needs to be focusing on issues that are much more targeted to the major culprits. Point that Zorba
Like
made.
whom?
BP. You know, there was a time when BP declared itself the energy company. The CEO of BP said, we are now really going to pay a lot of attention to the environment, deliberately set some standards which were unachievable. All the people in BP knew they were unachievable and ignored them. So it's not that difficult to identify companies that have really been quite heinous in their operations. And there you can have an impact. Embarrassment makes a difference. If you're not trying to embarrass 200, then we're all in the same boat. If you're trying to embarrass 10, it makes a difference. You want to look for win-wins, including the win-win of getting rid of subsidies, as I mentioned before. And you also need to institutionalize the movement. There was a famous article written many years ago by Anthony Downs, a political scientist, called something like the issue attention cycle up and down with ecology. Maybe that's not the exact title, but more or less. And Downs argued that everything goes through an issue attention cycle. That people get all fed up about something, they'll bury a Volkswagen as a symbol, tremendous enthusiasm, and then it dies out. But he was wrong about the environment. And why was he wrong about the environment? Because it became institutionalized. The EPA was formed. Why Richard Nixon did this is still somewhat of a mystery. A lot of environmental groups took on much more of a strictly environmental role instead of just let's protect one critter or another. And this has made a huge difference. So one question to all of you in the divestment movement is what comes next? Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that all the Claremont colleges declare you're going to sell all your stocks in 200 companies. Then what?
I thought you were going to answer that.
It's not for me to answer. I'm not in that movement.
So Paul, your hope and aspirations were clearly on the table. Can you give me the counter to your argument?
The counter to my argument? Let me give an example of an unsuccessful movement. First of all, I want to second Professor Asher's point about the importance of institutionalizing gains. If you want to defeat a student movement, all you have to do is wait for them to graduate. Right? So 4 years in that part of your life feels like day and night. Boy, waiting 4 years when you're in midlife or older, that's not such a long time. Just wait, they'll graduate. So think about institutionalizing.
If we give them A's, they'll go soon.
It's possible. I would say an example of students and others not having an impact on the world is the peace movement, which I think was, to a significant degree, successful in ending the conflict in Vietnam, but not in putting in place any sort of real alternative. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One is when it comes to questions of defense, the expertise is much more centralized. It is much more difficult for communities like Claremont or for student clubs to speak with any authority on any aspect of national defense, precisely because so much of the information is secret. You have to be on the inside to really be an expert. I recall we brought to UC Santa Barbara in 1986 Robert Bowman, the first director of the Strategic Defense Initiative Star Wars program, who came out as an opponent to that initiative. And I recall a debate between him and a member of the UC weapons laboratories in which the UC representative said, well, Bob, you've been on the outside for a couple of years now, and we've actually made a number of developments you're not aware of when debating the feasibility. So I think it was difficult for reasons that are not present in this instance. A second reason why I think the peace movement failed is a lack of an inability to propose alternatives. There was some talk of common security, some talk of alternative world arrangements. I don't think you could possibly reduce the U.S. defense budget without having Europe take over a significant chunk of responsibility for maintaining world peace, which would require of Americans getting comfortable with the idea of having to be told what to do once in a while by our partners across the Atlantic. So that might be a counterexample of a movement that I consider largely unsuccessful, and I was, as a student, very active in that particular movement for those reasons.
So I think we have one more question I can do. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So, Jess, what are the alternatives to play off of Paul's point, and also many of those that have come from the other people? If divestment, as you say, is a tactical move, it has a strategy, what is the thing that you're going to argue, or McKinnon will argue in terms of alternative processes?
To follow up with divestment? Well, there are a number of things that can happen. In terms of divestment specifically, the alternatives that are, I think, very good options for furthering the impact of divestiture in general are creating green revolving funds for the schools, in which funds that are divested are either placed directly into a fund in which those funds would go to supply monetary support for green projects on campus, such as investing those directly into a solar array for campus, or some larger project that would actually generate returns for the campus. Another option is to have alumni donations going into that fund as well, so that there is a revolving support for green initiatives on campus. And I think that that's a really great way to make divestment more than just a political statement and start to initiate some of the clean energy initiatives that we've been talking about a little bit. There are other options as well, including buying new funds, and there are some social responsibility funds, such as the Trillium Green Century Fund, which has been fossil-free since 2005.
So we're now moving into our third section, in which the panel gets to talk to each other instead of me. So if any one of you has a comment to the other, this is not the time to come out with another 5-point plan, John. Good though that might be, but really is a question. Bill.
There was some frustration expressed about Congress. It actually turns out that you can sue the U.S. government. And the way the EPA got any teeth whatsoever was that when it was founded with only a minimal budget, this was the collusion between President Nixon and Congress. We want to start something that makes it look like we're paying attention to the environment, but let's starve it for funds so that it can't actually do the testing to see what chemicals are really hazardous, which ones are not. There were lots of lawsuits that came out suing the government for nonfeasance, malfeasance, misfeasance, you name the feasance. And that was a really important initiative. Congress had to back down and fund this stuff. So they are not as powerful as you might think. If you can use some jujitsu and use the laws that are already on the books and make sure that, in fact, those laws are enacted. There are many laws on the books that are very powerful on paper. They're not enforced, the Endangered Species Act being one of them. But you do have the option of lawsuits to try to put more pressure to see that they do get enforced to a larger degree.
Others?
I guess I'd like to see more discussion of the distinction that's being drawn between divestment on the one hand and what's being cast as a more important measure, which is we need change in politics and policy. And I don't really see a distinction between those two. That is to say, if we think of this question not in the abstract of what might one do, irrespective of what one's resources are and where one is in life to affect this problem, then maybe I'd say call a meeting with Obama and, or who knows what. But as students, it occurs to me that there are a couple things we have to keep in mind. First of all is the phenomenon of momentum. So we're not asking this question in 2009. We're asking this question at a time when this train has left the station. There is a lot of movement behind it, and just one more sort of hand pushing along this stalled car on the railroad track can actually have more of an impact, I would argue, than trying to start from scratch some initiative that has not captured national attention. That does not mean one has to accept whole hog the way that it's being presented by 350.org, and I actually find very compelling the argument for a more targeted campaign, for example, that maybe could motivate. I'm not certain that companies will be motivated to change in any way by anything other than national legislation and statewide legislation, but if you're a fossil fuel company and you at least have an opportunity to be liked, then maybe there's some things you would do, whereas if no matter what you do, they're going to hate you because you're in this business, there's not much of an incentive for change within a company there.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that really quickly, if possible. Just in agreement with Professor Steinberg, I completely believe, and so does our whole divestment team, that divestment is a political action. And many of the greatest political actions have started at the grassroots level, as Professor Steinberg outlined for us previously. Divestment is already getting mentioned on a higher political level. For example, Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island stated to Congress that this movement by students deserves significant attention. Senator Kerry himself has divested, and the political momentum continues to grow. In terms of a targeted divestment campaign to more specific companies, I can understand that argument if we felt that there was going to be more of a significant economic impact immediately to those companies. But if we're talking about creating paradigm change and making a message that we want complete freedom from this industry, that we don't want them to rule the way that we live and determine the choices that we make, then why not divest from the top 200 companies? Why focus it on the filthy 15, which many schools are doing? But I say, while we're at it, why not just do them all? Honestly, when you take a look, we don't know what's in our investment portfolios at any of these schools, first of all, because it's all, we don't have transparency. It's all complicated and mixed in there. A lot of schools, once they've finally found out what companies they're invested in, they found maybe 3 on the list of 200. So if we limit that to 15 companies, we may go in there and see none. But if we expand it to the 200, then maybe we can get at a few of them and actually make a difference.
On that point, and just to play devil's advocate here, thinking about what impact a fairly small divestment could have, it seems to me that boycotts definitely have been strongest where a company's brand has been at stake. So there, it's a matter of talking about specific companies and talking about them and their specific outlaw actions. Sectoral boycotts, I think, are harder for the public to get their mind around, especially when it's a vital input that's generating the electricity to your house. And so I think that it maybe is a harder thing to get the media to portray on the front page or near the front page to have people think about sort of outlaw company of the week. Because you do, so when it's Chevron, when it's BP, when it's Royal Dutch Shell, I mean, you actually think about the specific environmental disasters that they have been involved in, and you're able to connect the dots between their practices and the lives of very specific people. And so that, I guess, would be the opposite. I think about, say, the Pesticide Action Network and the work that they've done with Dirty Dozen pesticides. And there are way more than 12 pesticides that are persistent and they're toxic and they're a problem. But the Dirty Dozen was a particularly successful campaign in getting some of the worst pesticides off the market and getting people thinking about how a particular pesticide is harming human health and the environment. So I guess that would be just an alternative thought, not necessarily, I'm also thinking as I speak. So I think this is all about, I think, all of us reasoning through what are the best ways of directing our time and action.
Yeah, just a few things. One is, I don't want you to take anything I said as suggesting that things be somehow sequenced in time, so much as sequenced in priority. So, in my opinion, these other things are more important than divestiture. That is, actually doing things, going and buying California Air Resource Board allowances, buying renewable energy credits and things like that, because they involve real sacrifice. Now, just to kind of make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of the economic facts, because it would bother me if anybody's laboring under different understanding. These guys don't need you to finance it. When you go buy their stock, you're not handing them money. I think you all realize that. You're buying the stock from somebody else. They floated their stock a long time ago. In 2011, Exxon had $450 billion of revenues. They had $55 billion of net revenues. What they did with those $55 billion was they gave $9 billion to shareholders. They put $20 billion back into the company in terms of new projects, and they bought back $22 billion of stock. They're buying their own stock back. You're not going to hurt them by divesting. Now, I agree, it's a political statement. I just want to make sure you guys understand that you're not thinking about this as being some economic avenue to pinching you, because it's not going to work that way. It's all political. The other thing I think you need to understand is that, Bill McKibben talks about, well, we have to stop, we have to basically stop them from using 80% of their reserves. Well, the oil companies are not what they used to be. 70% of the reserves in the world are controlled by non-publicly traded companies, like the Saudi Aramcos of the world. So you're targeting a fairly small, I mean, it's still huge, okay, but in terms of percentage, it's not the majority of reserves in the world.
So that leads us where?
That leads us simply to I just want to make sure that everybody has that in mind, that they're not going to somehow, sometimes it seems like people are still laboring under the assumption that these big American oil companies dominate the industry. And that may have been, and probably was true, before mid-1970s, but we're in a new world, okay?
I really appreciate those insights from someone who knows a whole heck of a lot more about the finances of this particular industry than I do. Still, when I was digging around to find some of the numbers, I think perhaps there's more, call it financial potential, even if it's not as punishment of company, than we might realize. So as many of you may know, the combined value of endowments of colleges in the United States is $400 billion, which is greater than the entire assets of ExxonMobil. Now, I agree, I'm not one to question whether the colleges are capable of bringing ExxonMobil to its knees, right? But for example, the Congressional Research Service dug around, they started interviewing companies to find out how much they actually spend on research, not just for alternatives, for everything. And the figure was about $3.5 billion. Okay, so if in fact we were to shift some money from place A to place B to support, for example, research on renewables, suddenly a small, some percentage of $400 billion in endowments seems to me to be a fairly significant sum, even just on the financials. Even just on the financials with the important provisos that Professor Jurowitz and others are providing here. I do think there are many models of potential change for a company. One of these models is something you might call big good, big bad. So just by virtue of their size, if campaigns like this one continue to embarrass these companies so they want this problem to go away, so even though they're not going to change their bread and butter activities, they're going to keep drilling and doing what they're doing, but they need to drop some money They need to drop some money like BP dropped $400 million for research into renewables in California. Just when you can convince a large organization to do something to try and make this problem go away, it can in and of itself be significant. Even if they consider it token money, even if they're sort of laughing around their conference table, it can actually be significant. The World Bank reforms are a classic case of this, where in response to protests within primarily the United States about World Bank lending practices, the World Bank didn't fundamentally alter its mission. However, it directed a lot of money toward environmental protection, such that the World Bank is the largest funder in the world of biodiversity protection, bar none. They have spent hundreds of billions of dollars on that over the last 20 years. So another of, I think, many potential models of change here is what I would call the good, big, big good, big bad sort of model, where maybe we can't stop them from doing their bad activities, but could perhaps inspire some sort of greater commitment to doing the right thing, which would be trivial by their standards, but by virtue of their size, would be non-trivial by our standards. Thank you.
So now we're going to open it up. Because we want to make sure you guys have some time for questions for the panel. So this room is small enough that normally you can just raise your hand and speak loudly, and you're heard just fine. But you can also come to the podium if you have a soft voice. And Char's going to take your turn.
Yes.
So far, the conversation seems to have been split into two major arguments. We've heard a lot of the argument for why it's not a successful economic campaign and possibly why it could be if we change where we're investing. I feel that largely has been ignored the social implications of this. We already have evidence that major news corporations, etc., are taking up some interest in this campaign, regardless of whether or not it's going to be portrayed in the best light. I think there is a tangible impact of the fact that by divesting from this direction, making a statement, and that I feel it has a much wider social implication than what we've been getting at. Of course, yes, we can change our, invest our time politically and have Congress change, but I think there's also much wider societal change that this can help influence. And it's not quite as easy of a way of putting our time in, we can vote, but we can't necessarily change the societal perception of something unless we do a symbolic act, more like what we're doing here. So I'd like to hear what your opinions are on the potential societal implications rather than the political ones.
One of my reactions is I want to convince myself that this isn't just going to contribute to the culture wars, where it basically just divides society more. And there'll certainly be people that will be trying to use it in that particular way. On the other hand, if you believe, and you may believe, and there's a basis for believing this, that if this initiative actually kickstart federal movement towards cap and trade, for instance, or a carbon tax. I've talked to plenty of people in the industry, and after being, and I've been in these sessions with them at Resources for the Future, very interesting sessions, talking about the pros and cons of cap and trade versus taxes. And at the end of the day, these guys throw up their hands and say, give me taxes. It's interesting. But so anyway, if this movement can be used to make something happen in Congress, then great. If it also can be used to mobilize people at a grassroots level to do things themselves, like I was talking about in terms of actually trying to decarbonize their own world, then that's great too.
Just to respond quickly as well, could all of you who hadn't heard of the Copenhagen Accord limit to 2-degree global temperature increase before this movement began, or even before tonight, could you raise your hand, please? If you had not heard of the 2-degree limit on global temperature increase before this movement, so that's a fair number of you. This movement is meant not only to initiate political change, but also to create a public discourse, as I mentioned before, about the real issue at stake here. People are starting to become familiar with the issue of climate change, and they're starting to realize this is serious shit, excuse my French. But I don't think that the general public is aware of really the measures that need to be taken. 2-degree increase, that is a solid number. That is something that is more tangible than our world is going to get really hot. People, it's hard to quantify that in your head.
And that's Celsius.
That's Celsius, so that's like, that's different, it's different.
That's French.
In terms of the economic effect and also tied up with the political effect as well, the HBSC report warns investors that 40 to 60% of leading fossil fuel firms' current market capitalization could be at risk if the international community sticks to its commitment to limit global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. So if this becomes an issue of social morality and political action, it really could have a long-lasting impact that could initiate some real change.
I guess the question is, what does come next? And if you want to make a societal change and make people more aware, then what's the transition from riding around in automobiles, even electric automobiles, after all, electricity has to be produced somehow. In fact, it's more likely that electricity is produced through coal than through gasoline. So what's your transition theory on this? Social change works if there are avenues to exercise, to manifest those social changes. I was at a meeting in Denver, which is one of the energy capitals of America now. And one of the speakers from a large energy company said that natural gas is the transition fuel. And it has a lot of advantages over coal and oil, but it's a hydrocarbon. And that's going to be our fuel for the next 20 years. And it's much better than those other hydrocarbon alternatives, especially coal. But that doesn't get you to the root of your problem. You don't want any hydrocarbons. So what do? Not go in an automobile? Not turn on the lights? How, you know, there's this concept in psychology of cognitive dissonance, where there are two different beliefs that are inconsistent with one another, and something has to give. So you tell people hydrocarbon industries are bad, the use of their products is bad, but they still have to go in the car and have the lights on. Something's going to go. What's going to go is the rejection of what you're arguing, because they're still going to ride around in the cars. So you really have to have some transitional strategy, and I haven't heard it articulated yet.
Another question, yes, please.
Well, I guess one place that I think I'd like to see this discussion go with all of you sitting here is that it seems that this obviously sort of wants to gravitate towards some kind of, excellent solution, where we can all figure out, like what are our transition strategies and where to go. But I remember at the beginning, you brought up how this is sort of this campaign is born of political frustration. And I guess my question is, given that 4 out of the 5 Cs are already committed to this president's climate commitment, which all of them have said we agree to be carbon neutral by X date. For Pittsburgh it's 2050, I think. It's been a little bit lax about filing reports, but it's kind of like their signatures on paper somewhere, and they've all agreed to do this. And so, given what that means for these colleges, my question is, where in the future do we get to divestment and say, oh, we're not going to do that? Is divestment a thing? Is divestment by any means a thing that shouldn't happen? Shouldn't it just be easy? You just tell someone get our funds out of here. I guess what are the difficulties of divestment that we have to have this account, that we have to get a signature from every student out of 5 colleges?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's that easy. I think the structure of long-term pool investment for the endowment is complex, and so you have large mutual funds that may have holdings in fossil fuels, and so there's a certain model of investing, right, that's been developed over time. And you also have to consider the fiduciary commitment of trustees. They don't own the college, they're trustees of the college, and by law, they are obliged to serve the mission of the college. And the college has a lot of things that it needs to do. It needs to fund its operations, it needs to pay for financial aid, it needs to pay salaries, a lot of other things. And so it's actually a really complicated thing to do to just say, oh, we'll divest. I think that there are some colleges that have jumped to say that they'll do this, but they've been actually very vague about the details. And as I understand it, it's not so easy. So I guess my feeling is that understanding the complexity of managing a very large amount of money with needs to have gains 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now is complicated, and it's worth learning about and trying to engage the trustees in this, because many of you will be working in organizations that similarly have large investments of pension funds and so forth, and so it's worth actually getting into the details of this. And so for that reason, I think that it's important to understand that the trustees, certainly at Pomona College, I think they all believe the science of climate change, and nobody's profiting from the prospect of climate change. So beginning with the belief that we share this future, we share values, and trying to find the grounds by which you can actually sit down and understand the complexity of this, educate people about that, and then think about what kind of time and energy it would take to come up with a model that still allows trustees to fulfill their obligations to the college while aligning the portfolio more closely with people's shared values. It's really tedious and hard, and it involves a lot of careful diplomacy and making alliances before you make enemies. And there's a point to that, but it's really tedious, careful work. And there's also, I think you talked about the importance of media coverage on this. And so media aren't going to be covering like careful insight, like closed door meetings where you're going over some confidential financial information and learning this information. So I actually see that there's a real tension between A, wanting to get the New York Times to talk about this, and B, actually wanting to achieve your objective, which is a long-term viable divestment strategy that still maintains all 5 colleges as institutions fulfilling public mission. So that's my feeling.
One thing you guys have to do, it seems to me, is push for transparency. I mean, I haven't had any discussion with trustees, and part of the process has got to be to do that and see why we don't have transparency. Maybe they've got some good reasons. I'm not talking about transparency day to day so you can front run what they're out trying to buy, okay? I'm talking about, even a normal financial institution has got that actually holds itself out to the public has got to file a report every 3 months indicating what it holds. It doesn't have to make reports in the meantime, because everybody knows it's out there jockeying around and they understand that they can't be disadvantaged. But on a quarterly basis, you find out exactly what these funds are invested in. Now, maybe we don't need it quarterly, but it seems to me we at least need it annually and maybe semi-annually. And I don't really understand, and I'm willing to listen to why we don't have transparency. Heather's absolutely right. We have to be sensitive. These guys have fiduciary duties. They have legal duties that they're sworn to. But, and she also mentioned the vehicles. We need to find out exactly what vehicles they're in. Are they in individual stocks? If they're in individual stocks, mostly, I think those things are very easily rearranged. I can substitute Procter & Gamble for Exxon. It's not exactly the same. I recognize that, but you don't lose a hell of a lot. I know enough about financial theory to know that. Okay, anytime you constrain yourself, you're not going to be able to do as well, but I don't think that's much of a constraint. But there's also problems in terms of going into more venture capitalism, capitalist stuff and renewables, and maybe their fiduciary duty really does truly limit their ability to rebalance the portfolio in that way. But I think there may be other avenues. Set up a separate fund, seek alumni contributions to a renewables fund, If it's got to be two funds, because people have already made donations based upon, these guys are only going to go out and invest in quadruple A securities, then I understand. If that was a fiduciary understanding when people gave them the money, then they better stick to it. But we can set up a separate fund with different objectives.
Of course, the limitation of setting up a separate fund is that money's fungible. So these guys want to balance it because of their fiduciary responsibilities. So if Exxon isn't in the special fund, Exxon may pop up in the other fund. That's the risk, if you're really interested in divesting.
We're having this talk in 2012, and it's been, an ongoing discussion. And some have said that, sorry, 2013.
It's ongoing already.
2013. I think this conversation is long overdue, and the world's global system is changing, climate change is rapidly occurring, positive feedback loops, etc. from a biological perspective. But what, in your opinion, politically, economically, should the president do first? Should Congress act first to limit and mitigate the changes that are already happening? Because the time is now, because the time is yesterday.
Ignoring the politics, adopt the combination of a carbon tax and cap and trade.
I agree with that. I'm a fan of the carbon tax. One option to make it more politically palatable would be proposing a revenue neutral carbon tax, which of course wouldn't take care of the revenue needed for the government. But if you were to put a tax on greenhouse gas emissions, and then the price is reflected in the market, then essentially all of the revenues collected for that would then be split up and sent back to taxpayers at the end of the year. So if you're living a really carbon smart lifestyle, you'll make a profit. If you are living a profligate lifestyle with 3 Hummers, etc., you will pay a lot in net taxes to the system. So it's a redistributive system that helps send a message to people, A, how carbon intensive a good or service is, and B, it also sends a personal signal to you as to how carbon smart you are. So that's one idea that has been floated out there.
Use the balanced budget.
I'd also like to add to that, to reject the Keystone XL pipeline.
Bill, do you have anything to add?
Not at this time.
I would add the importance of not overlooking state governments. We are not France or Germany or Norway trying to figure out how to do this. They don't have federalist systems we do. So we have serious regulatory authority vested at state levels. California has adopted a plan for addressing climate change that is every bit as aggressive as that of Europe. So California resembles Germany more so than it does Washington, D.C. And by the way, Spain resembles, what would it be, maybe Idaho more than the United States, than the European Union. So we should look at the state levels, and I would say state government within Sacramento is potentially more porous, more subject to student influence than is the capital in Washington, D.C. That system, of course, is broken. It's broken in large part because of money, to give you a sense of the money. The 10th, let's see, from 1998 to 2012, ExxonMobil was the 10th largest in terms of expenditures on lobbying. They spent $179 million lobbying during that period. And actually the top, and you can imagine that Exxon and the other oil companies contribute to this, was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that contributed $900 million to lobbying activities during that period of time. So that system, unfortunately, I certainly wouldn't give up hope, and I believe that a nationwide movement can, in many ways, make it easier for national policymakers to move, as well as more difficult for oil companies to oppose them. But I wouldn't want to overlook statewide initiatives. And by the way, when the oil companies tried to overturn Assembly Bill 32, California's climate change law, with that recent Proposition 23, according to the co-chairman of the opposition to 23, the one who wanted to keep in place our climate change law, he said one reason I think that we won is that there were a lot of other energy companies that might have wanted to try and overturn this law, but they didn't want to show their face, that they didn't want to be publicly embarrassed, they didn't want to be tagged as the bad guy. In other words, to the extent that initiatives like this create a general social atmosphere that makes it difficult for corporations to move with impunity to do things like, oh, what General Motors did to Los Angeles. You want to know what General Motors did to Los Angeles? You used to be able to take light rail from here to the beach, right? They created a front company, a bus company. They bought up all the rails in Los Angeles and other cities throughout the United States, and they literally set them on fire. I have the photos in one of my PowerPoint classroom settings. And this also speaks to an earlier point regarding, well, we're using fossil fuels, so isn't it somewhat contradictory for us to be against fossil fuels? Personally, I mean, I have a lot of awe and respect for these companies. You know, have you ever, you're driving along in a car and you think, wow, we invented this. Like, there's something incredible about the fact, about what these companies are doing insofar as harvesting energy for human use. What really gets me, though, is when they're not just providing the things that we are demanding. Many of these companies are actively lobbying to prevent the transition to alternatives. And this includes a company like Toyota. At the same time that they produced their Prius, they were lobbying the US government against an increase in fuel efficiency standards because they were all excited about getting into the truck market in the United States. So that's what really gets me. You can't blame somebody for providing an energy source that America demands, but you can blame them for acting politically and spending exorbitant sums in order to prevent us from transitioning to alternative fuels.
Getting back to this idea that things are often with always kind of being persuasion. Sorry, that's right. Sorry.
Well, let me,
Well, my question is, I feel that, but at the same time, you then went on to say that we need to do what we're doing really aggressively. And I'm just wondering, I guess, what do you mean by that? What's the real deal? What is this aggression that we need to do?
Well, I'm talking about, and what I was trying to say in 4 minutes, really, really quickly, with Lena on top of me here, was, basically, first of all, the idea about frustration is an idea that you'll find on 350.org. I mean, Bill McKibben admits that, he's tried other things, he's politically frustrated, and that's what this program, in his mind, that's in part what motivated this particular campaign. So the comment about frustration has to do with the way he's even characterized things. In terms of aggressiveness, again, I don't think you've got political credibility if you're not offsetting your automobile travel and your airline travel, and you're just saying, let's get rid of these companies from our endowment. That is like a no-cost to you initiative. I just don't think you've got any political credibility when you stop at that point. You've got to do something that actually demonstrates that you're willing to put some skin in the game yourself, personally, more than marching around and asking for endowments to be divested. I just think it's really, really cheap, and it can be easily characterized, and it has already been characterized by your political enemies as, well, there they go again.
What do you mean about the aggression?
I'm in an aggressive program, okay? I mean, just linguistically, maybe that was the wrong word for me to use for you. Aggressive program means you basically go deeply into investments in energy efficiency that a lot of people might look at and say, that's got a lousy payback rate. It's going to take you 10 years to recover your investment. So what? Do it.
All power to the people.
It's hard to decide what I want to address first. I truly believe that this is not a self-righteous or vain attempt at another college experience to be a part of something. I think many of us in the divestment team have been a part of a variety of different environmental sustainability initiatives and found that they feel great afterwards, they end with good conclusions, but then they kind of fizzle out at the end. For those of you who are on the team and the audience, who feels like this is going to fizzle out after it's over? All right, I haven't seen you at our meeting, so I won't.
Are you only talking about people on that team?
I am, because they're the ones who are a part of it right now and can understand the kind of excitement and inspiration that comes with this campaign that is not like anything else that I personally, and I won't speak for you, but I have not felt this kind of momentum or passion behind a movement that I've ever been a part of ever before. We're not just marching around demanding divestment thinking, okay, who cares if the college takes on all these extra costs and the Board of Trustees has to go through all this work and this effort and we don't have to do anything. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm spending 15 hours a week on this campaign. This is not no work, all right? Just to clarify. And this is also, as has been mentioned before, it's a communication, it's a cooperative conversation with these administrations. We're not busting into that trustee meeting on Friday at Pitzer saying, you better divest or else, and who cares what you have to do about it. We're going to go in there and try and find out what the process means, how we can help, how we can make it more feasible for the institution, and how we can get the best of both worlds out of that situation. This is not just another angry students parading around as social activists just for the sake of it. It's not about that. And divestment is not going to end here. This is not the end of this movement. By starting this movement and by participating in it at the level that we are right now, we are showing that we're ready to take on more serious actions after this. Divestment is not the last step at all.
Time for one more question. Oh, look at the hands. They're so eager.
Thank you all so much for being here, and I really love the discussion of what the next steps are going to be, because this is happening. We're going to do this, I think, and even if we don't, the rest of the country is going to without us. So in terms of the next steps, I was very interested to hear Professor Asher talk about subsidies, because I read recently that the fossil fuel industries in 2011 received $523 billion of subsidies globally. And so with that sort of financial power and that sort of political power now, thanks to Citizens United and just the way that politics is going, how do we have a conversation with them? I mean, what can we do to test them and to tell them that either they need to change the way that they're doing business, because ultimately these industries and these companies exist to provide us with goods and services, but at this point in time we recognize that what they're providing for us is actually going to kill us. So how do we convince them that they need to change what they're doing, or we need to hire someone new?
Well, those are excellent questions. Let me start out by saying that it's not that the companies give themselves subsidies, the federal government gives them the subsidies for complicated reasons. Second point, we're all getting subsidies too. Norman Myers, a British academic and researcher, probably 15 or 20 years ago, pointed out that gasoline should cost $4 a gallon. 15 or 20 years ago. Today, it should really cost probably something like $10 a gallon to take into account the societal costs of the various health problems, environmental problems, etc., that burning gasoline causes. So we're subsidizing ourselves financially by bettering ourselves in health and other respects like that. So I don't know how many of you go to the gas station, see the gas is now $4 a gallon, and say, damn it, I wish it were higher. I believe you. But I don't see people lobbying the California legislature to increase the California state tax on gasoline when the price of gasoline goes down. If we want to stabilize it, every time the world price of oil goes down and the price of gasoline could go down, we should increase the tax and keep it up at a fairly high level. Now, there's one more point. A lot of these hydrocarbon companies are feeling very vulnerable right now. because they know they're getting subsidies, they know that those subsidies are being challenged. It's not impossible to get some voluntary environmental agreements, VEAs, which cut through all the enormously long processes to get the EPA to do something, or to get the Air Board to do something and have EPA agree to it. And have some of these companies clean up their act, holding the subsidies they get hostage in a way. So that's another wrinkle to it. But the best strategy is to reduce the subsidies. And that's a matter of lobbying Washington.
I encourage folks to think about snowball effects, looking back to the last large-scale divestment campaign led by students with respect to South Africa. This started very small scale, but it quickly picked up momentum when public employee retirement systems started to disinvest their money. So it started at college campuses. Then within California, for example, CalPERS, which has enormous investments for public employee retirement purposes, withdrew their money from South Africa, at which point the state of California withdrew $3 billion from South Africa. And soon after that, Republican lawmakers were tripping over each other to try and be the first to talk about the importance of withdrawing U.S. funds from South Africa. Newt Gingrich actually was in charge of that initiative because it was so obvious that it was in the winds. They did not, and eager to court the African-American vote, they did not want to come down on the wrong side of that issue. So snowball effects of this sort can be very important. Interestingly, just last year, for the first time, CalPERS came out with a report that attempts to apply sustainability criteria to its own investment portfolio. The combined value of these portfolios throughout the United States at all the cities and state levels and so forth is over $1.5 trillion. And so snowball effects also can be very consequential when it comes not, again, just to that direct sort of attempted financial impact on a company, but the building a political momentum so as to change the regulatory structure. ExxonMobil does embrace cap and trade. They just happen to embrace it in Europe, where the policymakers already won, and they have to do it, and they are the largest oil company.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have, but can we please give a big round of applause? So a couple of announcements really quickly. This event is supposed to start to trigger conversation that can then later inform a Pomona-wide student body vote on investment in March. So I encourage you to go out to your friends and talk about both sides, all nuances of the discussion that were at this event, and also the ones that came to your mind as you sat and listened. Also, I want to say that PFC has a suggestion box that you should put comments in. And don't forget to buy tickets for the James Hansen event.
And what we would really like to have students go to here is James Hansen. The tickets are nominally $10, but you can pay whatever you want. You can pay now, you can pay at the door, you can pay nothing. The important thing is, if you'd like to go to hear James Hansen, pick up a ticket. There's a place to fill in your name and tear that off and give it to me. If you're not a student, it really will cost you $10, and it's just for that one lecture. But the tickets are available here, and I'd love to have you pick up some.
Thank you again.
I'd also like to say something really quick. Members of the Claremont College's divestment team will be outside collecting signatures, and if you're interested in getting involved with our campaign on any level, we'd love to take your contact info. Also, if you have any questions whatsoever about what we're all about, what we're doing, upcoming events, feel free to ask me or anybody sitting outside.